What would you do if the man who destroyed you was about to crown himself a king based on a lie only you could prove? Picture this. A ballroom filled with 300 of Washington's most dangerous people, crystal chandeliers catching the light of 1,000 candles, and at the center of it all, an ultrasound image projected 20 feet high on a screen, the image of an unborn child, an heir, a legacy. Then the doors open, and the woman everyone thought was broken walks back in. But here's the secret nobody in that room knew. The wife he threw away like garbage wasn't defeated. She was armed. Before we go deeper into the story, you are welcome to Empire Stories. We're building a community that refuses to accept neglect and betrayal as normal. If you believe women deserve respect, loyalty, and real love, not control disguised as protection, subscribe and help us get to 10,000 subscribers. Your support helps us spread these stories to people who need to know. They deserve better, and it's okay to walk away. The diamond ring hit the glass desk with a sound that seemed to crack the air itself. Lauren Grayson didn't flinch when she placed it there, right between the ultrasound printout and the divorce papers her husband had shoved toward her 15 seconds earlier. She just stared at the ring for a moment, watching the overhead lights catch in the stone. A 2-carat princess cut he'd given her on their wedding day, back when he still pretended to love her. Matthew Grayson sat across from her in his leather chair, the kind that cost more than most people's cars, his attention locked on the tablet in his hands. His dark eyes moved across the screen with an intensity usually reserved for reading death warrants. But this wasn't a contract or a threat. This was an ultrasound, black and white and grainy, showing the curved spine and beating heart of an unborn child. Behind him, barely visible in the dim light of his private office, stood Brittany Lowe, 26 years old, blonde, beautiful in that calculated way that required a team of professionals. Her hand rested on the subtle curve of her belly, and the smile on her face wasn't subtle at all. It was triumph, pure and venomous. "Sign it, Lauren." Matthew's voice was cold, flat, the same tone he used when ordering an execution. He still hadn't looked at her. "Brittany is giving me what you never could. An heir. A son to carry the Grayson name." Lauren looked at the ultrasound image reflected on the tablet screen, then at the woman who'd been her husband's secretary until she became something else entirely. For 10 years, Lauren had absorbed every insult Matthew threw at her. Every public humiliation at family dinners when he'd apologized to his lieutenants for her failure to produce children. Every late-night rant about her broken body and useless womb. She had built his empire in the shadows while he took credit in the light. She had managed his legitimate businesses, laundered his money through 17 shell companies, and kept the FBI off his back with accounting so clean it could have won awards. But today, Matthew wasn't just ending their marriage. He was rewriting history, erasing her like she was a mistake that needed correcting. He thought he was making a strategic move, discarding a defective wife to legitimize the child his mistress carried. He believed he was securing his dynasty. He had absolutely no idea he was signing his own death warrant. Lauren reached for the pen, a Mont Blanc he'd given her on their 5th anniversary, back when he still gave her gifts instead of contempt. The weight of it felt right in her hand. Familiar. She didn't hesitate, didn't tremble. She signed her name in 3 smooth strokes across the bottom of the document. Brittany's smile widened. Matthew finally looked up, something like satisfaction crossing his face. "There's a car waiting to take you to your father's old estate in Virginia," he said, already turning back to his tablet. "You'll receive a monthly allowance. Be grateful I'm being generous." Lauren stood, smoothing down her black dress. She picked up her purse, a classic Birkin, the only thing she'd be taking from this office, and walked toward the door. But she paused with her hand on the brass handle, looking back over her shoulder. "Matthew," she said softly. He glanced up, annoyed at the interruption. "That baby." She nodded toward the ultrasound. "I hope she's everything you've dreamed of. I really do." His brow furrowed slightly. "It's a boy." "Of course," Lauren said. "My mistake." She left the office, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady, measured rhythm. She didn't cry, didn't look back, because Lauren Grayson knew something her husband didn't. Something she'd known for 12 years and buried so deep that not even God himself could have found it without her permission. That baby couldn't possibly be his. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is a story about power, betrayal, and the kind of revenge that can only be served ice cold. This is the story of how a mafia boss destroyed the only person who ever protected him. How a mistress thought she could steal an empire with a pregnancy test. And how a woman everyone underestimated became the most dangerous person in Washington, D.C. This story will teach you something crucial. Never humiliate someone who knows your secrets. Never discard someone who built your throne. And never, ever assume that silence means surrender. If you've ever been called worthless by someone who wouldn't exist without you, if you've ever been blamed for something that wasn't your fault, if you've ever been thrown away after giving everything, this story is for you. Because Lauren Grayson spent 10 years being called barren. She spent a decade protecting a lie that would have destroyed her husband's reputation. She buried medical records, bribed doctors, and took the shame meant for him because she believed in something called loyalty. But loyalty is a two-way street. And Matthew Grayson just burned his side to the ground. The black Mercedes pulled away from the Grayson estate at exactly 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October. Lauren sat in the back seat, watching the mansion disappear in the side mirror. 30 rooms, marble columns, and gardens that required a staff of 12. She'd lived there for 10 years, planned every renovation, hosted every dinner party, turned it from a house into the seat of power for Washington's most feared criminal family. Now it belonged to a 26-year-old former intern who thought an ultrasound was the same thing as a crown. Lauren's phone buzzed. A text from her attorney. Documents processed. Monthly transfer set up as agreed. I'm sorry, Lauren. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her purse and pulled out a small key attached to a red ribbon. It was the key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank, the one her father had opened when she was 20 years old, right before he handed control of his territory to Matthew. The box contained a single sealed envelope marked with her father's handwriting. Only if you need to burn everything down. She'd visited that box exactly once in 12 years. 2 weeks ago, she'd opened the envelope, read the contents, and made copies. Then she'd put everything back and walked out of the bank with a smile that would have frightened anyone who knew what it meant. Ma'am, the driver's voice cut through her thoughts. We're approaching the Virginia estate. Would you like me to take you to the main entrance? No, Lauren said, her voice steady and clear. Take me to the guardhouse. I need to make a phone call first. She pulled out a second phone, a burner she'd bought with cash 3 weeks ago, and dialed a number she'd memorized but never called. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Who is this? It's Lauren Grayson. I need to speak with the Council of Elders. Tell them I'm invoking Article 7 of the Family Charter. There was a long pause. Article 7 hadn't been invoked in 40 years. It was the nuclear option, the rule that allowed any blood member of the founding families to call for a vote of no confidence in the current dawn. Mrs. Grayson, the voice said slowly, you understand what you're asking? I understand perfectly. Tell them I'll attend the succession ceremony in 6 months. Tell them I'm coming to bless the transition. And tell them to remember one thing. What's that? Family law exists for a reason. Blood is sacred. And anyone who pollutes the bloodline with a bastard doesn't deserve to lead. She ended the call and powered down the phone. Through the tinted window, she could see the Virginia estate coming into view. Smaller than the main house, but it had been her father's favorite because of the library. Walls lined with leather-bound books about strategy, history, and the art of war. Lauren smiled for the first time since she'd signed those divorce papers. Because Matthew thought he was entering his golden age, preparing to present his heir to the entire criminal underworld of the East Coast. He thought the next 6 months would be about celebration and succession planning. He had no idea they would be his last 6 months of freedom. and he definitely had no idea that the wife he'd just discarded was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. You can't build a legacy on a lie, especially when the truth is locked in a red envelope, waiting to be projected on a screen in front of everyone you've ever wanted to impress. The car stopped. Lauren stepped out into the October air, breathing deeply. The hunt had begun, and this time she wasn't the prey. The humiliation had started small, like most forms of cruelty do. Comment here, a joke there. Little cuts that Matthew delivered with a smile, as if they were observations rather than weapons. But by year 3 of their marriage, when Lauren still hadn't gotten pregnant, the cuts became deeper, public, intentional. The dinner party 2 years ago was when Lauren realized her husband didn't just resent her, he hated her. It was a Friday night in November, and the Grayson estate was filled with the kind of people who made their fortunes in the shadows. 15 of Matthew's most trusted lieutenants sat around the mahogany dining table, their wives dressed in designer clothes that cost more than most people's mortgages. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. Servers moved silently between courses. Everything was perfect, controlled, exactly as Lauren had planned it. She sat at the far end of the table opposite Matthew, wearing a burgundy dress that had taken her 3 weeks to find. She'd spent the afternoon overseeing every detail, the flower arrangements, the wine pairings, even the temperature of the room. These dinners mattered. They were where deals were made, alliances formed, and power consolidated. Matthew was holding court in the middle of a story about a shipping contract when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His eyes landed on Lauren, and something shifted in his expression. Something cruel. "You know what the problem is with legacy?" he said, his voice carrying across the table. Every conversation stopped. All eyes turned to him. You can build an empire, control half the eastern seaboard, have more money than God. But none of it means anything if you don't have an heir to pass it to. Lauren's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She knew where this was going. She'd felt it building all evening. "My father had 5 sons," Matthew continued, swirling the whiskey in his glass. 5. And here I am, married for 8 years, and I can't even get one. He looked directly at her, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. "I apologize, gentlemen. I know you're all waiting for me to produce the next generation. Trust me, I'm trying. But sometimes the tools you're given just don't work." The table went silent. A few of the men looked down at their plates. Their wives exchanged glances that ranged from pity to barely concealed satisfaction. One of the lieutenants, a man named Joseph who'd been with the family for 30 years, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Matthew, It's fine, Joseph." Matthew cut him off. "Lauren knows I'm not blaming her. It's just biology, right, sweetheart? Some women are built for it, some aren't." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the luck of the draw. Have you ever been blamed for something that wasn't your fault while everyone around you stayed silent?" Lauren picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip, her hand perfectly steady. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She just smiled, small, polite, the smile of a woman who'd learned to survive by becoming invisible. "If you'll excuse me," she said quietly, setting down her napkin. "I need to make a phone call about the Seattle situation." Matthew waved her off dismissively, already turning back to his lieutenants. "See? Always working. At least she's useful for something." The laughter that followed her out of the room was worse than the insult itself. Lauren walked through the marble hallways to Matthew's private office, her heels clicking in rhythm with her heartbeat. The Seattle situation was real. A shipping deal with a Chinese distributor that had been falling apart for 3 weeks. Matthew's lieutenant on the West Coast had botched the negotiations so badly that they were about to lose a $12 million contract. Matthew had spent the past month complaining about it but doing nothing to fix it. She sat down at his desk, pulled out her personal laptop, and opened the encrypted file she'd been building. 20 minutes and 3 phone calls later, she'd restructured the entire deal. She offered the Chinese distributor a 10% stake in the Portland warehouse operation, an asset Matthew didn't even remember he owned, and sweetened it with priority shipping routes through Vancouver. It was elegant, simple, and completely legal on paper. By the time she returned to the dining room for dessert, the Seattle deal was saved. $12 million secured with a few phone calls and the kind of strategic thinking Matthew would never credit her for. She slipped back into her seat. Matthew was in the middle of another story, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. He didn't even glance at her. None of them did. To the men at that table, she was exactly what Matthew said she was. A beautiful, barren wife who'd failed at the one job that mattered. But Lauren knew something they didn't. She knew that while Matthew played king, she was running the kingdom. She knew that half the deals he took credit for had been salvaged by her in the background. She knew the books, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. She knew everything. And she knew that the man who'd just humiliated her in front of 15 witnesses was sterile, had been since birth, would never father a child, no matter how many mistresses he took to bed. She'd been protecting him from that truth for 8 years, burning medical records, paying off doctors, taking the blame and the shame so his reputation would stay intact. That night, watching him laugh with his men while servants cleared the dessert plates, Lauren made a decision. Not immediately, not in anger, but quietly, the way all the most dangerous decisions are made. The protection was over. The shield she'd built around his ego would come down. And when it did, Matthew Grayson would learn what it cost to humiliate the only person who'd ever truly protected him. She just had to wait for the right moment, the right weapon, the right audience. She had no idea that 2 years later, a 26-year-old intern with ambition and a pregnancy test would hand her all three. Brittany Lowe had been working in the Grayson organization for exactly 11 months, when she walked into Matthew's office with news that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March, unseasonably warm, and Lauren was in the kitchen reviewing the quarterly reports from their legitimate holdings when she heard Matthew's voice echo through the hallways. "Are you serious? Are you absolutely certain?" Lauren's pen stopped moving. She'd heard Matthew angry before, frustrated, cold, but this was different. This was joy, pure, unfiltered, almost manic joy. She set down the financial statements and walked quietly toward his office. The door was half open, and through the gap she could see Brittany standing in front of Matthew's desk, her hands clasped in front of her stomach in a gesture that was either protective or performative. Probably both. "I took 3 tests," Brittany said, her voice soft and careful. "They're all positive. I'm about 8 weeks along. I wanted to tell you before anyone else knew." Matthew was out of his chair before she finished speaking. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into an embrace that looked more like a claim of ownership than affection. When he pulled back, his hands went immediately to her stomach, pressing against the flat surface as if he could feel something already growing there. 8 weeks, he repeated, and Lauren could hear the calculation in his voice. He was doing the math, tracing back to figure out when it happened. In his mind, he was probably remembering some specific night, some moment of passion that had finally given him what his wife never could. Lauren watched from the hallway, completely still. She felt nothing. Not anger, not jealousy, not even surprise. She'd known about the affair for 6 months, had seen the way Matthew looked at Brittany during office meetings, the way his hand would linger on her lower back when he thought no one was watching. Affairs were practically a tradition in their world. Lauren had expected it eventually. What she hadn't expected was this. The pregnancy. The miracle that defied biology itself. "We need to get you to a doctor," Matthew was saying. "The best one. I want confirmation, ultrasounds, everything. I want to know if it's healthy. I want to know if it's a boy." "Matthew," Brittany said, and there was something almost rehearsed in her tone. "What about Lauren? How are we going to handle this?" Matthew's expression hardened. "Lauren is not your concern. This child is my heir, my legacy. Everything else is just paperwork." Lauren turned and walked back to the kitchen, her footsteps silent on the marble floor. She picked up her coffee cup, now cold, and dumped it in the sink. Through the window, she could see the gardens where she'd spent 10 years planning every hedge, every flower bed. She'd built this place into something beautiful. And now a 26-year-old former intern was about to inherit it based on a lie so obvious it would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. 3 weeks later, Matthew scheduled the ultrasound appointment. He didn't tell Lauren directly. She found out from his assistant, a woman who'd worked for the family for 15 years and still had enough loyalty to give Lauren a heads up. The appointment was set for a Thursday afternoon at a private clinic in Georgetown, the kind of place where wealthy men took their mistresses when discretion was more important than medical ethics. Lauren made sure she was home when they returned. She was in the library, pretending to read, when she heard the front door open and Matthew's voice filled with an excitement she hadn't heard in years. "Lauren, come here. I need to show you something." She marked her page and walked to the foyer. Matthew was standing in the center of the marble entryway, his phone in one hand and Brittany on his arm. The girl looked radiant. Professionally done hair, designer maternity clothes that must have cost thousands even though she was barely showing. She had the expression of someone who'd just won a lottery she'd rigged herself. "Look at this," Matthew said, shoving the phone toward Lauren. On the screen was an ultrasound image, black and white and grainy, showing the curved shape of a fetus. 11 weeks. Healthy heartbeat. Everything's perfect. Lauren looked at the image for a long moment. She'd seen ultrasounds before, of course, had friends who'd gotten pregnant, had attended baby showers where these exact images were printed on napkins and cake toppers. This one looked completely standard, completely real, completely impossible. "Congratulations," Lauren said quietly. "When are you due?" "September 23rd, Brittany answered before Matthew could. "We're hoping for a boy, of course, to carry on the family name." "Of course," Lauren echoed. Matthew pocketed his phone and turned to Lauren with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Almost. We need to talk. In my office. Alone." That was the conversation where he'd served the divorce papers, where the ring had hit the glass desk, where Lauren had signed away 10 years of her life with 3 strokes of a pen. But standing in that foyer, looking at an ultrasound of a child that couldn't possibly be her husband's, Lauren felt something shift inside her. It wasn't anger or pain. It was clarity. Cold, perfect, devastating clarity. Matthew thought he was securing his legacy. Brittany thought she was securing her future. They both thought Lauren was the obstacle that needed to be removed, the broken piece that had held Matthew back from his destiny. What do you think hurts more, being replaced, or watching someone celebrate a lie you're the only one who can prove? They had no idea that the woman they were discarding had spent 12 years protecting a secret that would destroy them both. They had no idea she had the medical records locked away in a safety deposit box. They had no idea that their miracle was about to become their downfall. And they definitely had no idea that Lauren Grayson was about to stop playing defense and start playing a very different game. One where she held all the cards, knew all the rules, and was finally ready to burn the whole house down. Let them have their ultrasound. Let them plan their future. Let them think they'd won. Lauren would wait. She was good at waiting. She'd been doing it for 12 years. But this time, she was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The packing took less time than Lauren expected. 10 years of marriage condensed into 3 suitcases and 2 garment bags. She moved through the master bedroom with mechanical precision, pulling items from drawers and closets, sorting what belonged to her from what belonged to the wife Matthew had wanted her to be. The designer dresses Matthew had bought for her to wear to his business dinners, left hanging in the closet. The jewelry he'd given her on anniversaries while barely looking at her face, left in the velvet boxes on the dresser. The expensive perfumes, the silk robes, the Italian leather shoes that had turned her into the perfect accessory for a man who valued possessions more than people. All of it stayed behind. What Lauren packed was different. The books her father had given her on her wedding day, Sun Tzu's Art of War, Machiavelli's The Prince, and a leather-bound journal with his handwriting on the first page. Never forget who you were before he made you into who he needed. The photographs from her childhood, from college, from the years before Matthew Grayson had convinced her that love and loyalty were the same thing. The simple gold chain her mother had worn, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd survived worse than she had. She packed the person she'd been before Matthew, the person she was about to become again. It was nearly midnight when she finished. The estate was quiet except for the sound of her footsteps echoing through the hallways as she made one final trip. Not to her bedroom, not to say goodbye, but to the study on the 2nd floor where the family safe was hidden behind a painting of Matthew's grandfather. A man who'd built this empire with violence and vision, and who would have been ashamed to see what his grandson had become. Lauren knew the combination. She knew everything about Matthew's operation, every secret, every vulnerability. She spun the dial with practiced ease, right to 17, left to 43, right to 29, and heard the click of the lock releasing. The heavy door swung open, revealing stacks of cash, property deeds, and several envelopes marked with codes only Matthew and his most trusted people understood. But Lauren wasn't there for money. She reached past the cash to the small wooden box in the back corner, the one Matthew hadn't opened in years because he'd forgotten it existed. Inside was a single red envelope, sealed with wax, her father's handwriting across the front. Lauren Marie Castellano. Only open when you're ready to finish this. Her father had given it to her the day she married Matthew, when she'd taken the Grayson name and left the Castellano legacy behind. He'd pulled her aside right before she walked down the aisle and pressed it into her hands. "You're making a mistake marrying him," her father had said. "Matthew is ambitious but reckless, smart but cruel. But you're my daughter, and I respect your choice, so I'm giving you this. It contains everything you need if this marriage ever becomes a cage instead of a partnership. The medical records, the proof, the insurance policy." Lauren had buried the envelope in the safe and tried to forget it existed. She'd believed in Matthew then, believed he would grow into the man she saw hidden beneath the arrogance, believed their marriage could be real. She'd been wrong. Now, holding the envelope in her hands, Lauren felt the weight of 12 years of protection, sacrifice, and silence. This wasn't just paper. This was power. The kind of power that could end a dynasty or crown a new leader. The kind of power Matthew had no idea she possessed. She slipped the envelope into her purse, closed the safe, and turned to find Matthew standing in the doorway. He was wearing the same suit from earlier, loosened tie, whiskey glass in hand. He'd been drinking. She could see it in the slight sway of his posture, the lazy confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" Matthew asked, leaning against the doorframe. "That's cold, Lauren. Even for you." "I signed the papers," Lauren said calmly. "There's nothing left to say." "True." He took a sip of his whiskey, watching her over the rim of the glass. "You know, I almost feel bad. 10 years is a long time to invest in something that didn't work out. But that's business, right? Cut your losses. Move on to better opportunities." Lauren picked up her purse and walked toward the door. Matthew didn't move, forcing her to stop inches from him. "Don't worry, Lauren," he said, and his smile was pure cruelty. "I'll send you a photo of my son when he's born. Maybe you can hang it on your wall and remember what you couldn't give me." For 10 years, Lauren had swallowed insults like this. She'd absorbed them, buried them, pretended they didn't cut. But tonight, with the red envelope in her purse and clarity burning cold in her chest, she stopped pretending. She looked directly into Matthew's eyes, those dark eyes that had once made her believe in romance and destiny, and spoke in a voice so calm it could have frozen fire. "Be careful what you wish for, Matthew." His smile faltered slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Lauren said, stepping past him into the hallway, "that sometimes the things we want most are the things that destroy us. You'll understand soon enough." She walked down the grand staircase for the last time, her heels clicking against marble she'd personally selected. The driver was waiting by the front door with her luggage already loaded. She didn't look back at the estate, at the home she'd built, at the life she was leaving behind. Because Lauren Grayson, no, Lauren Castellano, she was reclaiming that name now, wasn't running away. She was repositioning, regrouping, preparing for a battle Matthew didn't even know was coming. He thought he'd discarded her, replaced her with a younger, fertile version, upgraded to a woman who could give him the legacy he craved. But legacy isn't built on lies, and empires don't survive when the foundation is fraud. Matthew would learn that lesson in 6 months, in front of 300 witnesses, when the wife he'd thrown away came back not to beg but to bury him. The car pulled away from the estate at exactly 12:47 a.m. Through the rearview mirror, Lauren watched the lights fade into darkness. Phase 1 was complete. The exit was clean. The weapon was secured. Now came the hard part, waiting for Matthew to build his throne high enough that the fall would be spectacular. And Lauren had always been exceptional at playing the long game. 6 months passed like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. Lauren watched from a distance as Matthew's world transformed into something she barely recognized, built on foundations of sand and fantasy. The first thing Brittany changed was the mansion itself. Within 2 weeks of Lauren's departure, the renovation crews arrived. The burgundy curtains Lauren had imported from France, torn down and replaced with stark white drapes that made the rooms look cold and sterile. The artwork Lauren had spent years collecting, pieces from galleries in New York and Milan that told the story of the family's rise to power, removed and replaced with oversized modern paintings that looked like they'd been selected by someone who confused expense with taste. Lauren heard about it through her sources. The housekeeper who still texted her updates. The gardener who'd worked for her father and had no loyalty to Matthew's new regime. The family attorney who'd watched Brittany write checks with Matthew's accounts and couldn't hide his concern during their weekly calls about the divorce settlement. She spent $80,000 redecorating the nursery, the attorney had said during one call, his voice tight with disapproval. Custom furniture from Italy. A chandelier that costs more than most people's cars. And that's just one room, Lauren. The bills are, well, they're substantial. Lauren had thanked him for the information and hung up with a smile. Let Brittany spend. Let her transform the estate into a monument to her own greed. Every invoice was evidence. Every receipt was ammunition. But Matthew saw none of it. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was consumed by a single obsession. The child Brittany carried. His heir. His prince. His legacy made flesh. The reports Lauren received painted a picture of a man who'd lost all sense of reality. Matthew had converted his entire study into a shrine to the unborn baby. Ultrasound images pinned to the walls like battle plans. Baby name books stacked on his desk. He'd commissioned a portrait artist to paint a family tree, with his son's name, Harrison Matthew Grayson, already inscribed at the bottom in gold leaf, as if the child's existence could be willed into legitimacy through sheer force of belief. He threw a gender reveal party in the mansion gardens that cost $200,000. Pink and blue fireworks that lit up the Washington sky. A 5-tier cake that revealed blue layers when cut. Matthew had stood in front of 100 guests. Lieutenants, business associates, people who pretended to respect him while quietly wondering if he'd lost his mind, and announced that the Grayson bloodline would continue for another generation. The baby was born on September 19th, 4 days ahead of schedule. A boy, 7 pounds 6 ounces. Healthy. Perfect. Brittany had sent out birth announcements printed on cardstock, so thick it felt like parchment, with a photograph of the infant's tiny hand wrapped around Matthew's finger. The caption read, "The future dawn." And that's when Matthew made the decision that would seal his fate. He organized the succession ceremony. It was unprecedented. In the 70-year history of the Washington families, no one had ever held a formal ceremony to name an infant as heir. The position of Don was earned through respect, strategy, and the approval of the Council of Elders, not announced at a party like a corporate merger. But Matthew was beyond reason. He rented the Basilica Grand Hall, a venue usually reserved for presidential galas and diplomatic events. He hired an event coordinator who'd planned weddings for senators and fundraisers for billionaires. He ordered custom invitations on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that read, "You are cordially invited to witness the official presentation of Harrison Matthew Grayson, heir to the Washington Territory." 300 invitations went out to every major family on the East Coast, to business associates, politicians who owed Matthew favors, judges who'd been bought years ago, even to rivals, families who controlled territories in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, because Matthew wanted everyone to see his triumph, his virility, his victory over the barren wife who'd held him back for a decade. The ceremony was scheduled for October 15th. 6 months and 2 weeks after Lauren had walked out of the mansion. The same amount of time it took for empires to fall in ancient Rome, though Matthew didn't know his history well enough to appreciate the irony. Lauren received her invitation on a Tuesday afternoon. It arrived at the Virginia estate in a cream envelope, hand-delivered by courier. She opened it at the kitchen table, reading the gold-embossed text with the same expression she'd used to review a quarterly financial report. Clinical, detached, perfectly controlled. But inside, something shifted. The game had entered its final phase. Matthew had built his stage, assembled his audience, positioned himself for the coronation he believed was his destiny. He'd done exactly what Lauren needed him to do. He'd gone public, made it official, turned his lie into a ceremony that the entire criminal underworld of the Eastern Seaboard would witness. And he'd invited her. The RSVP card sat on the table, blank. Lauren picked up a pen. Not the Mont Blanc she'd signed the divorce papers with, but a simple ballpoint, the kind ordinary people used for ordinary tasks, and checked the box marked, "Yes, I will attend." In the space for the number of guests, she wrote, 1. She sealed the RSVP card in the return envelope and set it aside for mailing. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call to a number she'd been saving for exactly this moment. "It's Lauren Castellano," she said when the gravelly voice answered. "Tell the council I'm invoking my right to address the ceremony. I have evidence that affects the legitimacy of the succession." There was a pause. What kind of evidence? The kind that proves Harrison Grayson isn't a Grayson at all. Another pause, longer this time. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Castellano." "It's not an accusation," Lauren said calmly. "It's a fact. And I can prove it in front of everyone Matthew has invited to witness his glory. The council will want to review your evidence before. The council will see it when everyone else does. October 15th. Tell them if they want to protect the integrity of the bloodline, they'll give me 5 minutes at that ceremony. That's all I need." She ended the call and looked at the invitation still sitting on the table. In 6 months, Brittany had erased every trace of Lauren from the mansion. In 6 months, Matthew had convinced himself that his miracle was real. In 6 months, they'd built a fantasy so complete that neither of them could see the truth waiting to destroy it. But Lauren had spent those same 6 months preparing, planning, sharpening the blade that would cut through every lie Matthew had told himself. October 15th was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks until Matthew stood in front of the most powerful criminals on the East Coast and tried to legitimize a child that biology said couldn't exist. 3 weeks until Lauren Castellano reminded everyone that legacy isn't built on lies, and that the woman they'd all dismissed as weak was about to become the most dangerous person in the room. The ceremony was coming, and Lauren was ready. The Council of Elders met in places most people didn't know existed. Not boardrooms or restaurants, but in the forgotten corners of power where decisions that shaped cities were made over glasses of 40-year-old scotch and handshakes that meant more than any contract. Tonight, they met in the back room of a Portuguese restaurant in Georgetown that had been family-owned for 60 years. The kind of place where the front dining room served tourists and locals, while the back room, accessible only through an unmarked door near the kitchen, hosted conversations that never made it into any official record. Lauren arrived at exactly 9 p.m., dressed in a charcoal gray suit that had belonged to her father. She'd had it tailored to fit her, kept the original buttons, preserved the scent of his cologne that still lingered faintly in the fabric. It was armor and memorial both, a reminder to everyone in that room of who she was before she became Matthew Grayson's discarded wife. 5 men sat around a circular table. The Council of Elders, the true power structure beneath the public-facing dons who commanded territories and made headlines. These were the men who decided disputes, enforced the old laws, and determined who was fit to lead. The oldest among them was 83, a former don from Philadelphia named Augustine, who'd built his empire before half the current generation was born. The youngest was 57, but even he carried the weight of decades in this world. They all stood when Lauren entered, not out of chivalry, but out of respect. These men had known her father, had worked alongside Carlo Castellano when he'd controlled Washington before handing the territory to Matthew. They remembered when Lauren was a child sitting at her father's knee during strategy sessions, absorbing lessons about power and legacy before most girls her age knew their multiplication tables. "Lauren," Augustine said, gesturing to an empty chair, "you honor us with your presence. It's been too long." "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Lauren replied, taking her seat. She accepted the glass of wine that was poured for her but didn't drink. This wasn't a social call. A man named Dominic, who controlled the Baltimore territory, leaned forward. "We received your message about the succession ceremony. You want to address the gathering regarding Matthew's heir. That's an unusual request." "It's an unusual situation," Lauren said calmly. "Matthew has the right to name his successor," another elder said, a man called Thomas from the New York family. "The ceremony is traditional, even if the timing is premature. The child is barely a month old." "I'm not questioning Matthew's right to name an heir," Lauren replied. "I'm questioning whether the child he's presenting is actually his heir to name." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. 5 pairs of eyes fixed on Lauren with an intensity that would have broken most people. These were men who'd ordered executions over dinner and slept soundly afterward. Men who valued bloodline above almost everything else. "That's a serious accusation," Augustine said quietly. "Do you understand what you're implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a biological fact that I can prove with medical documentation." Lauren set her purse on the table and pulled out a folder. Not the original red envelope, but copies she'd had made. Professional, clinical, irrefutable. Matthew Grayson has been sterile since birth. He has a condition called congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens. I discovered this 12 years ago when he refused to see a doctor about our inability to conceive. I buried the records to protect his reputation. She slid the folder across the table. Augustine opened it, his weathered hands steady as he reviewed the medical reports. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, understanding, and beneath it all, fury at the deception. "If this is true," Dominic said slowly, "then the child Matthew is presenting as his heir cannot possibly be his," Lauren finished. "Which means Matthew has been deceived by his mistress, and he's about to commit fraud in front of the entire East Coast leadership. He's about to pollute the Grayson bloodline with a bastard and call it legacy." The elders passed the folder between them, each reviewing the documents with the careful attention of men who understood that empires rose and fell on evidence exactly like this. Birth records, medical diagnoses, lab results that couldn't be argued with or explained away. If you were building a legacy, would you want it built on truth or lies? "Why didn't you reveal this years ago?" Thomas asked. "Why protect him?" "Because I was his wife," Lauren said simply. "I believed in loyalty. I believed that protecting him was my duty, even when it cost me everything. Even when he blamed me publicly for something that was his biology, not mine. I took that shame because I thought it was what a wife did. And now," Augustine asked, "now he's thrown me away to legitimize a lie. Now he's about to present a fraud to the families and call it succession. Now he's making a mockery of everything my father built and everything you've spent your lives protecting." Lauren's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. The family law is clear. Bloodline is sacred. Legacy must be legitimate. Matthew is about to violate both. The room fell silent. The elders exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of reading situations and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "What do you want from us?" Dominic finally asked. "I want 5 minutes at the ceremony," Lauren said. "I want to present this evidence publicly, in front of everyone Matthew has invited to witness his triumph. I want the truth spoken where it cannot be buried or denied. And then I want the council to do what the family law demands when a Don is proven unfit." "You're asking us to strip him of his position," Thomas said, "in front of 300 witnesses. But tonight the hall belonged to a different kind of power." 300 guests filled the space, dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year. These weren't politicians or socialites. These were the heads of criminal families from Boston to Atlanta, business associates who'd built fortunes in shadows, lawyers and judges who'd learned long ago that justice was negotiable. The Washington underworld in all its dark glory, assembled to witness what Matthew Grayson believed would be his coronation. Lauren arrived exactly 15 minutes after the ceremony began, late enough to make an entrance but not so late as to seem desperate for attention. She wore a simple black dress, elegant, understated, the kind of outfit that whispered power rather than screaming it. No jewelry except her father's signet ring, which she'd moved from her right hand to her left. A statement for anyone who knew how to read it. She scanned the room as she entered, cataloging faces and reactions. The Council of Elders sat in the front row, their expressions carefully neutral. Matthew's lieutenants filled the seats behind them, men who'd served under her father and now served under Matthew, their loyalty as flexible as their morals. And scattered throughout the crowd were the representatives from other territories, here to assess whether Matthew was worthy of respect or just another ambitious fool with more ego than sense. At the front of the hall, on a raised platform draped in burgundy velvet, stood Matthew and Brittany. He wore a custom tuxedo that probably cost $15,000, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Brittany stood beside him in a gown covered in diamonds that caught the chandelier light like stars, the dress cut to show off her post-pregnancy figure while maintaining just enough modesty for the occasion. In her arms, wrapped in white silk blankets embroidered with the Grayson family crest, was the baby. Harrison, the heir, the prince who couldn't possibly exist. Matthew was mid-speech when Lauren took her seat in the back row. His voice carried across the hall with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years commanding rooms. "And that's what tonight represents. Not just the birth of my son, but the birth of a new era for the Grayson family. An era of strength, of virility, of blood that will carry our legacy forward for generations." He paused, letting the words sink in. Several guests nodded. A few raised their glasses. Matthew smiled, feeding off their approval like oxygen. "You all know that leadership requires certain qualities," he continued. "Vision, ruthlessness, the ability to make hard decisions. But above all, it requires the ability to secure the bloodline, to produce heirs who will carry the torch when we're gone. That's what separates kings from pretenders. That's what separates strength from weakness." Lauren watched from the back of the hall, her expression perfectly composed. She knew where this was going, could feel it building like pressure before a storm. "For 10 years, Matthew said, and his tone shifted, became harder, colder. "I was held back by a situation that prevented me from fulfilling that fundamental duty. 10 years of stagnation, 10 years of excuses, 10 years trapped in a marriage that produced nothing but disappointment." Heads turned slightly. People in the audience knew he was talking about Lauren, even if he didn't say her name. The insult hung in the air like smoke. "But tonight," Matthew raised his glass, "tonight we move beyond that stagnant era. Tonight we celebrate the future. My son." My legacy. Proof that when you remove the obstacles holding you back, when you choose strength over sentiment, greatness is possible. Brittany stepped forward, adjusting the baby in her arms so the crowd could see his small face. She looked radiant, triumphant, like a woman who'd won a war without firing a shot. Harrison Matthew Grayson, Matthew announced, his voice ringing through the hall. The future dawn of Washington. The heir who will build on everything we've created and take it even further. A child born from strength, from virility, from the kind of power that cannot be denied. The applause started slowly, then built. Glasses were raised. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Salute!" Others joined in. Matthew stood on that platform, holding court, basking in admiration he believed he'd earned. He looked out over the crowd, his expression one of absolute certainty. This was his moment, his vindication, his proof that discarding Lauren had been the right choice, that moving on with Brittany had been strategic genius, that the past 10 years of stagnation were behind him forever. What do you think goes through a man's mind when he's convinced he's untouchable? Lauren remained seated in the back row, watching, waiting. The red folder sat in her lap, invisible to everyone around her, but heavy with the weight of truth. She'd listened to Matthew insult her, mock their marriage, reduce 10 years of loyalty and sacrifice to a stagnant era that he'd overcome. She'd expected nothing less. Matthew had always been predictable in his cruelty. But now, in front of 300 witnesses, in front of the council, the families, everyone who mattered in their world, he'd made his lies official. He'd claimed virility he didn't possess, celebrated strength that was fiction, presented a bloodline that was fraud. And in doing so, he'd given Lauren exactly what she needed. An audience, a confession, and a stage. Augustine caught her eye from the front row. The slightest nod. Permission granted. It was time. Lauren stood slowly, the movement drawing attention from people nearby. She didn't rush, didn't announce herself. Just walked down the center aisle with the same measured grace she'd used to leave the mansion 6 months ago. The red folder held loosely in her hands. Matthew was still talking, something about tradition and dynasty, when he noticed the shift in the room. The way conversations stopped. The way heads turned. The way the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. He looked up from the platform and saw her. His expression flickered, confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear if he'd been smart enough to understand what was coming. "Lauren," he said, and the microphone caught the surprise in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Lauren stopped at the base of the platform, looking up at the man who destroyed her marriage, mocked her loyalty, and built his empire on a lie she'd protected for 12 years. "I'm here to bless the transition, Matthew," she said calmly. "Just like I promised. May I have 5 minutes of your time?" Before he could refuse, Augustine stood from the front row. "The council has granted Ms. Castellano the right to address the ceremony. Please proceed, Lauren." Matthew's face went pale. Brittany's smile faltered, and Lauren Castellano stepped onto the platform to begin the kind of public execution that didn't require bullets. Just truth, spoken loud enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard. The platform felt solid beneath Lauren's feet. She'd walked across stages like this before, at charity galas, at business conferences, at dinners where she'd stood beside Matthew and smiled while he took credit for her work. But this was different. This time, she wasn't background decoration. She was the main event. Matthew stood frozen beside the podium, his expression caught between confusion and anger. Brittany had taken a step back, clutching the baby closer to her chest like a shield. The diamonds on her dress caught the light, refracting it into tiny rainbows that danced across the platform. She looked younger suddenly, less triumphant, like a girl who'd walked into a game she didn't understand. Lauren turned to face the audience. 300 faces stared back at her. Some curious, some hostile, some, like the Council of Elders in the front row, carefully neutral, waiting to see what truth she'd brought to destroy a man who'd thought himself untouchable. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Lauren began, her voice calm and clear. She didn't need a microphone. Her father had taught her how to command a room with presence alone. I know you weren't expecting to hear from me. After all, I'm part of that stagnant era Matthew just mentioned. The obstacle he removed, the weakness he overcame. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd. Matthew's jaw tightened. But I'm not here to argue about the past, Lauren continued. I'm here to talk about legacy, about bloodline, about the sacred laws that govern all of us in this room. She paused, letting the words settle. Because tonight, we're being asked to witness something unprecedented. The formal presentation of an heir. A child who will supposedly carry the Grayson name into the future. A dynasty secured. She turned slightly, nodding toward the massive screen behind the podium. It currently displayed the ultrasound image that had been shown during Matthew's speech, the grainy black and white proof of Harrison's existence. The image that had convinced Matthew he was finally a father. That's a beautiful ultrasound, Lauren said. I remember seeing it 6 months ago, right before Matthew served me divorce papers. I remember thinking how miraculous it was, how impossible. She reached into her folder and pulled out a small remote control, the one she'd arranged with the audiovisual technician an hour before the ceremony, along with a very generous cash payment for his cooperation and silence. What are you doing? Matthew's voice cut through the hall, sharp with warning. Lauren didn't answer him. She just pressed a button on the remote. The lights dimmed, not completely dark, but enough that every eye in the room turned toward the screen. The ultrasound image flickered, distorted for a moment, then disappeared. In its place, a new image appeared. A medical document, blown up 20 feet high so every word was visible even from the back row. Georgetown Medical Center. Patient, Matthew Robert Grayson. Date, March 15th, 12 years ago. Diagnosis, congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens. The hall erupted in whispers. People leaned forward in their seats. Someone in the middle row stood up to see better. Matthew's face went from pale to crimson in the span of 3 seconds. Get that off the screen, he demanded. Now. Lauren ignored him. She pressed the remote again. A second document appeared. This one was a lab report, dense with medical terminology but with one line highlighted in yellow. Patient presents with obstructive azoospermia. Prognosis, irreversible male factor infertility. For those unfamiliar with medical terms, Lauren said, her voice cutting through the chaos. Let me translate. Matthew Grayson was born without vas deferens, the tubes that carry sperm. It's a congenital condition. He's been sterile since birth. Completely, irreversibly, permanently. The whispers turned into audible gasps. Brittany's face had gone white. She looked at Matthew, then at the baby in her arms, then back at the screen as if the documents might change if she stared hard enough. That's a lie, Matthew said, but his voice lacked conviction. Those documents are forged. She's doing this because she's bitter. The documents are real, Lauren interrupted. Signed by Dr. Richard Chun, verified by 2 independent specialists, and stored in the Georgetown Medical Archives for the past 12 years. The council has copies. They can verify authenticity. Augustine stood from the front row, holding up a folder identical to Lauren's. We've reviewed the evidence. It's legitimate. The hall exploded. People were on their feet now. Conversations erupted like wildfire. Someone shouted a question that got lost in the noise. Matthew stood at the podium, his carefully constructed image crumbling in real time as 300 witnesses watched the foundation of his legacy crack apart. Lauren pressed the remote one more time. A third image appeared on the screen. A medical diagram showing the male reproductive system, with the vas deferens highlighted and labeled. Then, next to it, a simplified chart explaining exactly what absence of the vas deferens meant for fertility. 0 sperm count. No possibility of natural conception. No biological children. Ever. I discovered this 12 years ago, Lauren said, and now her voice carried steel beneath the calm. Matthew refused to see a doctor about our infertility. He was convinced the problem was mine. So I went to his primary care physician, asked for his medical history, and found this diagnosis from a routine physical he'd had in his 20s. He'd been told the truth and dismissed it, forgot about it, assume it didn't matter. She turned to face Matthew directly now. I buried these records. I paid off the staff at Georgetown Medical to keep them confidential. I took the blame for our childlessness because I thought protecting your reputation was my duty as your wife. I let you humiliate me at dinner parties, call me barren in front of your lieutenants, apologize to everyone for my failure, all while knowing the truth, all while protecting you from it. Matthew opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a man drowning in public, reaching for something solid and finding only air. Lauren turned back to the audience. So when Brittany announced her pregnancy 6 months ago, I knew immediately what it meant, because biology doesn't lie. Matthew Grayson cannot father children, which means the baby he's presenting as his heir tonight, the child he's asking you all to accept as the future Dawn, cannot possibly be his. She let that truth hang in the air for 3 seconds. Then she looked directly at Brittany, who was now visibly shaking. Unless, Lauren said quietly, someone would like to explain how a miracle occurred. I'm listening. The silence that followed was absolute. 300 people, and not one of them made a sound. They all just stared at the platform where a man's empire was dying in real time, where a mistress realized her con had been exposed, and where a woman everyone had underestimated was teaching them all an expensive lesson about truth, legacy, and the price of betrayal. Lauren stood perfectly still, the red folder in her hands, waiting for someone to challenge what couldn't be challenged, waiting for someone to deny what couldn't be denied. And in that silence, Matthew Grayson's dynasty came to an end. Lauren reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a laser pointer, small, silver, the kind professors used in lecture halls. She clicked it on, and a red dot appeared on the massive screen behind her, tracing a line along the medical diagram that was now burned into the retinas of everyone in the Basilica Grand Hall. Let me explain what you're looking at, Lauren said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone teaching a class rather than destroying a life. This is the male reproductive system. These tubes here, she circled the vas deferens with the laser pointer, are called the vas deferens. They transport sperm from the testicles to the urethra during ejaculation. Without them, sperm cannot leave the body. Without them, conception is biologically impossible. She moved the laser pointer to highlight the diagnosis on the adjacent medical document. Matthew has a condition called congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens, PAVD. He was born without these tubes. Both sides. It's not something that develops later in life. It's not something that can be fixed with surgery or treated with medication. It's permanent. Absolute. He has never been able to father children, and he never will be able to. Someone in the audience, a woman from one of the Baltimore families, said loud enough to be heard, "My God!" Matthew was gripping the podium now, his knuckles white. "This is insane. You can't stand here and—" "I can," Lauren interrupted, her voice cutting through his sputtering like a blade. "Because it's true. And because you refused to face it 12 years ago when it would have saved us both a decade of misery." She turned back to the audience, lowering the laser pointer but not putting it away. "When we'd been married for 2 years and I still hadn't gotten pregnant, I suggested we both see fertility specialists. Matthew refused. He said there was nothing wrong with him, that it had to be me, that women in his family always got pregnant easily. So the problem couldn't possibly be genetic on his side." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. They remembered those years, remembered the dinner parties where Matthew had apologized for Lauren's failure, remembered the jokes, the subtle digs, the public humiliation. "So I went to his doctor alone," Lauren continued. "I explained our situation. I asked if there was anything in Matthew's medical history that might explain our infertility. And that's when I learned the truth. Matthew had been diagnosed with CPAVD during a routine physical when he was 23 years old, 3 years before we met. The doctor had explained it to him, told him he was sterile, recommended genetic counseling. Matthew dismissed it, forgot about it, decided it didn't apply to him because accepting it would mean accepting a flaw he couldn't tolerate. She paused, letting that truth settle over the room like ash after an explosion. When I saw those records, I had a choice. I could tell Matthew the truth, force him to confront his own biology, and watch his reputation crumble. Or I could bury the evidence and take the blame myself. Lauren's voice dropped lower, more personal. I chose to protect him. I burned the original records after making a single copy that I locked away. I paid the medical staff at Georgetown to flag his file as confidential. I made sure no one would ever accidentally mention it in conversation or reference it in a consultation. She looked directly at Matthew, and for the first time since stepping on that platform, emotion flickered across her face. Not anger, something deeper, disappointment. Do you know what they were going to call you, Matthew? The lieutenants who saw those records before I destroyed them? They were going to call you the Mule, a man who looked strong but couldn't produce offspring. A leader with no legacy. I stopped that nickname from spreading. I took the shame that belonged to you and wore it myself for a decade. I let you humiliate me at dinner parties. I let you apologize to your associates for my broken body. I let you blame me in front of the entire organization for something that was your biology, not mine. The room was utterly silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. 300 people sat frozen, watching a woman dismantle a man's entire existence with nothing but truth and evidence he couldn't refute. I did all of that, Lauren continued, because I believed in something called loyalty. I believed that protecting your reputation was worth sacrificing my own. I believed that a wife's duty was to shield her husband from truths he couldn't handle, even when it cost her everything. She turned away from Matthew and walked slowly across the platform toward Brittany, who had gone so pale she looked like she might faint. The baby in her arms had started to fuss, making small sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Lauren stopped 3 feet from the mistress who'd thought she could seduce her way into a dynasty. But then you announced your pregnancy. And Matthew, she gestured back toward her husband without looking at him, celebrated it as proof of his virility, his strength, his ability to finally produce the heir I'd denied him. She raised the laser pointer again, aiming it at the medical documents still displayed on the screen. Except biology doesn't care about ego. Biology doesn't care about desire or belief or how badly a man wants something to be true. Biology is fact. And the fact is that Matthew Grayson cannot father children. Lauren's gaze locked onto Brittany's, and when she spoke next, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the hall. So unless a miracle occurred, unless God himself intervened to rewrite the laws of human reproduction, that child in your arms belongs to another man. Brittany's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. She looked at Matthew, desperate for him to defend her, to save her, to do something. But Matthew was staring at the floor, his entire body rigid with humiliation, so complete it had rendered him speechless. Would you like to tell us who the father is? Lauren asked pleasantly, as if she were inquiring about the weather. Or should we ask around? I'm sure someone in this room knows. Affairs are hard to keep completely secret. Someone always sees. Someone always knows. A man in the 5th row, one of Matthew's younger lieutenants, barely 30 years old, had gone bright red. He was staring at his shoes with the intensity of someone who desperately wished he could disappear. Several people near him noticed, glanced between him and Brittany, started doing the math. Or perhaps, Lauren said, turning back to address the full audience, it doesn't matter who the biological father is. What matters is who he isn't. What matters is that Matthew Grayson stood before all of you tonight and presented a fraud. He asked you to accept a bastard as his legitimate heir. He asked you to witness a succession built on a lie. He violated the most sacred law we have, the integrity of bloodline, because his ego couldn't accept the truth about his own body. She walked back to center stage, standing in the spotlight that had belonged to Matthew minutes ago. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about a bitter ex-wife trying to hurt the man who left her. This is about protecting what all of you have spent your lives building. This is about ensuring that legacy means something, that bloodline means something, that the laws we follow aren't just suggestions we ignore when they're inconvenient. Lauren held up the red folder one last time. I protected Matthew's secret for 12 years. I sacrificed my reputation, my happiness, and my dignity to keep him on the throne my father entrusted to him. But protection ends when the person you're protecting weaponizes your loyalty against you. Protection ends when lies become more important than truth. Protection ends when someone tries to build a dynasty on fraud and expects everyone to celebrate it. She set the folder down on the podium and stepped back. Her part finished. The evidence was presented. The truth was spoken. The audience had witnessed everything they needed to make their judgment. Now it was time for the council to do what they'd been empowered to do since before Lauren was born. Protect the integrity of the bloodline and remove leaders who proved themselves unfit to lead. The chaos started small. A murmur here, a raised voice there, then exploded like a grenade detonating in the center of the Basilica Grand Hall. 300 people were on their feet, shouting questions, hurling accusations, demanding answers from a man who had none to give. Brittany moved first. She thrust the baby into the arms of a stunned woman in the front row and bolted toward the side exit, her diamond-covered gown glittering under the chandeliers as she ran. She made it exactly 12 feet before two security guards, men who'd served Lauren's father and had been quietly briefed before the ceremony, blocked her path. She tried to push past them. One caught her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough that escape became impossible. "Let me go!" Brittany's voice cracked with panic. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You defrauded the Dawn," one of the guards said calmly. "You're not leaving until the council determines what happens next." Matthew stood frozen at the podium, watching his world collapse in real time. His carefully styled hair had fallen across his forehead. His expensive tuxedo suddenly looked like a costume on a man playing a role he'd never deserved. He turned toward the Council of Elders, his eyes desperate, reaching for help from the only people with power to save him. Augustine rose slowly from his seat in the front row. At 83, he moved with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned that authority didn't require speed. The hall quieted as he stood, 300 pairs of eyes shifting from Matthew to the man who'd been enforcing family law since before most of them were born. "Matthew Grayson," Augustine said, and his voice carried the weight of decades. "Do you dispute the medical evidence presented here tonight?" Matthew's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Those records. She had no right to." "Do you dispute it?" Augustine repeated. The silence stretched. Matthew looked at the screen still displaying his diagnosis, at Lauren standing calm and composed beside the podium, at the 300 witnesses who were all waiting for him to claim the documents were fake. But he couldn't, because they weren't fake and everyone in that room knew it. "No," Matthew finally whispered. "I don't dispute it." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. "Then you admit," Augustine continued, "that you cannot biologically father children, that you have been sterile since birth, and that the child you presented tonight as your heir cannot possibly be yours." Matthew's shoulders sagged. "Yes, you were fooled by a girl barely half your age," Augustine said, and there was no mercy in his tone. "You endangered the integrity of our bloodline with a bastard. You stood before the leadership of the Eastern Seaboard and tried to legitimize fraud. You violated the most sacred law we have, the law of blood, because your ego couldn't accept the truth about your own body." He paused, letting each word land like a judge reading a death sentence. "Matthew Grayson, the Council of Elders finds you unfit to lead the Washington Territory." The hall erupted again, but Augustine raised his hand and the noise died. By the authority granted to this council under Article 7 of the Family Charter, we invoke the ancient law. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your position as Don. Your assets are frozen pending investigation into how family resources were used to support this deception. Your authority over the territory is revoked. Your name, he paused, letting the cruelty sink in, remains Grayson only because we cannot rewrite your birth certificate, but your legacy ends tonight. Matthew stumbled backward as if he'd been physically struck. You can't. I built this territory. I expanded operations into 3 new states. I doubled our revenue. You built nothing, Dominic said, standing from his seat beside Augustine. Lauren built it. We all knew it. We watched her fix your mistakes, save your deals, and run your empire while you took credit. The only thing you built, Matthew, was an illusion, and illusions don't survive truth. 2 guards approached the platform. Not the same ones holding Brittany, but men who'd served under Matthew for years. Men whose loyalty had always been to the position, not the person holding it. They reached Matthew's side, standing close enough that escape became impossible. Wait, Matthew said, and now his voice carried genuine fear. What about? I need to. Where am I supposed to go? That's not our concern, Augustine said coldly. You have 48 hours to vacate the Grayson estate. Take your personal belongings. Everything else belongs to the territory. A small monthly stipend will be provided, enough to survive but not enough to rebuild. Consider it mercy you don't deserve. He turned away from Matthew as if the man had already ceased to exist, focusing instead on the larger question that hung over the hall like smoke. The Washington territory requires leadership. We cannot leave it rudderless. Under family law, succession passes to blood relatives of the founding families who have demonstrated loyalty, competence, and commitment to protecting our interests. Augustine's gaze swept across the crowd, though everyone already knew where it would land. Lauren Castellano protected this territory for 12 years while wearing another man's name. She sacrificed her reputation to shield us from the truth of Matthew's sterility. She managed operations, secured deals, and maintained stability while Matthew played king. Tonight, she upheld family law when it would have been easier to stay silent. She put the integrity of bloodline above personal grievance. He turned to face Lauren directly. Lauren Castellano, daughter of Carlo Castellano, granddaughter of Antonio Castellano, both former dons of Washington, the council recognizes your claim and your service. Do you accept the position of Don? The hall went absolutely silent. This was the moment that would reshape the power structure of the entire Eastern Seaboard. A woman ascending to leadership in a world that had been run by men for 3 generations. Some faces in the crowd showed approval. Others showed doubt. A few showed barely concealed hostility. Lauren looked at Augustine, then at the council, then at Matthew, broken, humiliated, everything he'd built reduced to ash in less than an hour. She felt nothing for him. Not satisfaction, not pity, not even anger anymore. Just the cold clarity of someone who'd finally stopped protecting the wrong person. I accept, Lauren said. The council members stood as one, a gesture of recognition older than anyone in that hall. Augustine removed a ring from his own hand, the signet of the council, passed down through generations, and approached Lauren. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. Then, by the authority vested in this council, we name you Don of Washington. May you lead with wisdom, protect the bloodline, and remember that power is earned through service, not claimed through ego. Lauren slipped the ring onto her finger. It was heavy, cold, and fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. The applause started slowly, then built. Not everyone was happy about it, but enough recognized that Lauren had earned this moment through sacrifice, competence, and the kind of loyalty Matthew had never understood. She'd protected the family when protection was needed. Now she would lead it. Matthew was escorted off the platform, through the crowd that parted for him like he carried disease, and out the front doors of the Basilica Grand Hall. The guards walked him to a car. Not his Mercedes, but a basic sedan that looked like something ordinary people drove. They gave him an address where he could stay temporarily, a phone number to call about the stipend arrangements, and a final warning: don't come back to the estate. Don't contact the organization. Don't try to rebuild. Your time is over. They left him standing on the curb as the car pulled away, alone in a city he'd once controlled. 3 weeks later, Lauren sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table in the Grayson estate. No, the Castellano estate now. She'd already changed the name. 15 of her most trusted people surrounded her. Some had served under Matthew. Others had served under her father. A few were new, recruited specifically because they understood that competence mattered more than tradition. They were reviewing expansion plans for operations in Richmond. Lauren was explaining a new strategy for the shipping routes when someone mentioned seeing Matthew outside an apartment complex in Virginia, looking thin and tired, like a ghost of the man he'd used to be. "Should we be concerned?" one of the lieutenants asked. Lauren set down her pen and looked up. Through the dining room windows, she could see the gardens she'd designed, the estate she'd built, the legacy she'd protected even when it cost her everything. "No," she said simply. "Matthew Grayson is no longer our concern. He's a lesson, a reminder that ego without substance, ambition without integrity, and lies without consequence, they all collapse eventually. We move forward." She returned to the shipping route plans, and the meeting continued. Outside, the Washington sun set over an empire that had changed hands not through violence or inheritance, but through the oldest power in the world. Truth spoken loud enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard. Matthew had wanted a legacy. He'd gotten one, just not the kind he'd imagined. And Lauren Castellano, the woman he'd thrown away like garbage, now sat on the throne he'd built on lies, because she'd been strong enough to protect the truth until the perfect moment to wield it. If you believe loyalty deserves respect and cruel betrayal should face consequences, hit subscribe. Only people like Matthew won't.